the topic for tonight is visual literacy, a crisis of method. So you would see for those people who are joining us live, and also for people who would be watching this as a recorded material. So we have slides now. So just take note that we have slides. But if you're watching it in Spotify, may video naman ang Spotify. Ang Apple Podcast nga lang, puro audio. So sorry for that. We would recommend you go to YouTube for the visuals now. YouTube and Spotify. So tonight, we're going to discuss visual literacy, a crisis of method. Just a run through of the topic. So the term visual literacy seemed to have gained newfound traction in recent times with established practitioners such as Jes Aznar being vocal about this advocacy. In public engagements and on his personal page, he has also directed this call to action not only to peers, but also to the general public. While such push is not new, being the core preoccupation of educational and professional institutions, such as Benilde, UP, ACFJ, and PCP, hashtags such as spread visual literacy, hashtag visual literacy, and hashtag media literacy gives this endeavor a public dimension. Nevertheless, a critic on this push reveals a possible weak point. At its current iterations, differing invariably across various advocates, the discussion of visual literacy has an unclear context from which a general understanding can be drawn out of, as well as an absence of a clear manifest objective to which such rigorous efforts can be directed to. Visual literacy is broad and takes on very different meanings depending on use and audience. While fundamentally related, which is to say, to be visually literate is to know how to make sense of visual phenomena, and in the context of this talk, photographic visual phenomena. Most of what we conceive as visual literacy has the danger of dissolving into obscurity, as the imprecision to which it is used in discourse lacks a solid foundation and thus arguably preventing it from being a true battle cry to rally on. Tonight, we endeavor to contextualize what is visual literacy, identify the agents who are involved in shaping this goal, and the methods to which it is operationalized in Philippine contemporary visual culture. Thank you for joining us for episode 8 of the Marites Talks Kwentuhan session on Philippine photography, entitled Visual Literacy, a Crisis of Method. Yeah, so this is going to be a recorded Zoom session. You will be prompted by Zoom for your consent in recording of this material. The recording shall be uploaded to Photography Chismis PH and its various platforms such as, but is not limited to, Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify for educational purposes in the aim of contributing to the discourse of photography in the Philippines. Third, this episode of the Kwentuhan session shall not be monetized. So just to clarify, derived knowledge from this program should be cited accordingly based on the conventions and laws on intellectual property in the Philippines as applicable. Lastly, this Kwentuhan session is an informal discussion and is not a lecture. Comments and suggestions shall be recognized accordingly by the host and moderator as applicable. So for those who are joining us for the live session, if you have questions, just type it in the chat box. A little bit of plug. So as mentioned, so Photography Chismis is in YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, but the home is in Facebook. So with that, ayan, I think one of the things that people might have noticed when we were promoting this episode was that it seemed ominous. The title of this episode is Visual Literacy, a Crisis of Methods. So the question is, given that, would you agree that there is a crisis in visual literacy? Siguro I'd go with Sir Francis first and then just...
I think visual literacy, yes, there's a crisis on the skill of visual literacy, the need for, I think, not just students, but for the public to develop yung fluency in the language of photographs. And I think there's a crisis on the method because if we look at the local context within the Philippines, I think there are different approaches or different definitions of what visual literacy is. Therefore, we have different approaches how to achieve visual literacy. So if we compare it, let's say, to the United States, where they have an accepted working definition of what visual literacy is and ano yung competencies ng visual literacy, it is already, I think, implemented in their common core curriculum. So it's clearly defined to them what it is. I think locally in our context, um, I think it's people are just learning what visual literacy is, and I think wala pa ring working definition for us, or we don't have an agreed method how to achieve it.
So later, Sir Francis, meron ako mga follow-up questions doon, pero siguro I'll turn over the floor to Jes muna.
Nung tinanong yung nilagay mo yung title, yung about visual literacy if it's a crisis of method. Actually, ang daming tanong na napunta sa isip ko eh. Ang dami kong naging tanong. I mean, is it really a crisis of method? I mean, do we really have, some level of visual literacy in the first place? Of course there is. Pero, I mean, kung titingnan mo sa States or any other, developed countries, they actually have a subject. They actually have a course on visual literacy as early as grade schoolers, middle schoolers. Pero sa Pilipinas wala eh. Parang especially nung 'di ba, nung nagkaroon ng changes sa education system, pumasok ng K-12, halos nawala na yung mga arts and humanities subjects. Well, meaning mostly nawala yung art studies. Pero kung yung sa ibang mga bansa, meron na sila actually na visual literacy as a subject. No, they really defined that it should be, it should be taught to children, to kids, especially yung elementary years, high school years. So ganun siya ka-importante. I just really don't know bakit dito sa Pilipinas wala. Yeah, well, instead na dine-develop siya, lalo siyang tinatanggal. As in relation to the newer education systems that we have. So yun, actually mas marami akong tanong ngayon eh.
The two of you highlighted visual literacy for the public, or at least in terms of the educational institution or educational system. Kasi one of the ideas also, as mentioned by Francis, is that there is a concern to which discourse, so at least to what domain are we trying to apply visual literacy. Sir Francis, na-mention mo na in the US, at saka si Jes nabanggit niya na in other countries, visual literacy is part of the educational system. So specifically, anong level? I mean, in a way, similar na yung system ng Philippines at saka abroad dahil nagkaroon na ng K-12, no? Pero visual literacy, at what part of the human development is it being taught?
Like sa US, like the common core curriculum. So it's the curriculum that they use for pre-K until grade 12. Yung visual literacy is an identified skill or competency na dapat ma-demonstrate ng student. Therefore, it's not only taught in one class actually, but it's actually integrated in other subjects that parang there's no relation to art. Minsan nasa mathematics class siya or nasa social science class siya. So yung skill that they have identified of what visual literacy is, sometimes it's a skill that also is being asked to be demonstrated or to be part of another class beyond arts or beyond the visual arts na classes nila. So we could see na for them, the skill of visual literacy is important not just for those who are going into the field of photography or in the arts, but rather every single student needs to develop that skill kasi important siya with how we are communicating today.
Siguro, if I can draw some conclusions from what you said, Sir Francis, no? Yung visual literacy, you've highlighted that it's not necessarily in the field of arts. It's something that you have to be a productive member of society. Diba? I mean,
Yes.
to highlight.
Yeah.
So hindi lang siya parang need for an artist eh. Parang it's now a need of every single person. Kasi the way we have communicated or the way society has changed, parang nakita nila na it's a competency that everybody needs to develop. That's why in the United States, sa Common Core, it's for every single student. Hindi lang siya exclusively for art students. And it is developed and it is taught in all of the levels from pre-K to, I think, grade 12 or even until college level. Of course, yung level of discourse or the level of assignments or activities, nag-iiba siya depending also on the level of engagement dun sa student. But you could see na yung skills that na-define nila of what visual literacy is, ina-apply din nila to other subjects. Kasi I think part of it is they've also identified na may funding na nawawala sa art. So certain art programs are being removed from the curriculum. So kung wala ka ng art classes, how do you still teach visual literacy outside of the art classes? So I think yun yung kailangan natin in our educational system. We also have to, since we're reviewing the K-12 curriculum, maybe we also need to review na, is visual literacy a competency that Filipinos need?
Yeah. Actually, Sir Francis, that you worded it very perfectly, no? And you explained it very perfectly. I mean, in other countries, they're really, visual literacy for them is really important. It's something, as you said, I mean, as you said and as we read, you know, it's something, it is a core competency, you know. It is a toolbox. It's actually not a skill. Whereas, you know, in contrast, dito sa Pilipinas, parang, how many times have we heard, really, I mean, how many times have we heard yung phrase na, oops, if someone sees something visual, usually people, 99% or actually 99% people would say, uy, para sa mga artist lang yan. Like for example, photography, for example, like, well, inside the newsroom, I'm going to be using newsrooms as an example because that's where I have, you know, experience. That's where I have been exposed to. So this experience na yun, ano? So inside the newsroom, normally if you're looking at something visual, actually ano yun, automatic yun. Ituturo mo agad artist, photographer, or something that who understands, you know, who understand the visual object. Pero may nakakapagtaka, bakit sa ibang bansa ganun? Bakit sa ibang bansa hindi mo na kailangan ng quote-unquote God-given talent for you to be able to discern the visual object that is in front of you. So parang meaning it should be, you know, visual literacy should be something that's being taught to everyone, or ako nga tingin ko nga katulad yan ng driving, swimming, alam mo yun, yung mga kasama sa mga important life skills na dapat tinuturo sa mga bata, maliit pa lang. And especially sa field ng photography. Ay, nako. Ito medyo controversial to eh. I mean, napaka-privy ng mga photographers eh. Like for example, they see a picture that was taken by someone who is not a photographer. Parang malaki kagad yung question mark eh, di ba? Parang, uy, bakit siya yung nag-shoot, di ba? Photographer ba yan? Di ba? Something like professional ba yan? Or if you see someone on the street, you know, wearing a camera, or someone who has a DSLR, you know, or, you know, a gear or a camera that's better than yours, una mong tanong, uy, professional ba yan? Magaling ba yan? Like parang, in the context of the Philippines, parang tatanungin mo, masyadong backwards pa yung pag-iisip ng majority. Na tipong, if they see something visual, automatically, for most of us, it is something that has to do with, you know, a visual person, and only a visual person, like an artist or a photographer, can explain it, or can articulate it, can read it, or, you know, can appreciate it. Bakit hindi po pwedeng, you know, lahat? Especially now. I mean, now we're looking at, you know, the boom of cell phones and cell phone cameras, or even all the communication platform that we use every day. It's actually all very visual. I mean, Facebook is visual. Instagram is visual. I mean, WhatsApp, Viber, messenger, or everything, they're all very, very visual, you know.
At saka,
Kaya, so yun yung tanong eh. I mean, actually, isang malaking tanong ko pa eh. I mean, how are we faring, you know, as a country in visual literacy? Do we really have visual literacy? Are we that literate enough? Or are we taking visual literacy very seriously? I mean, especially now, ano? I mean, digital na eh. I mean, everything now is very, very visual. Lahat ng mga nakikita natin ngayon is visual na. So, so ganun. So, doon ko nakikita yung delineation ng ano eh, ng problem. There are still, you know, some of us, those, so actually majority of us who doesn't see the transition, didn't see the transition, and are not seeing where we are today.
siguro siguro kung huhugot din ako sa sinabi ni Jes, no, what he is also saying na people might think visual literacy is composition, parang na-associate yung being able to read an image in the framework of photography, when in fact, no, it's in the domain of contemporary visual culture. So visual literacy doesn't necessarily mean photography. It's us participating in society. Noong 80s, merong na-coin na term, which is visual culture. So pag sinabing visual culture, it encompasses a wide-reaching discussion of what we see. However, once I introduce that term na visual culture ngayon, it would bring us back to the question, kung ganun siya ka all-encompassing, we are trying to talk about our entire lives as people who can see, probably we might need to have a method in the sense na iba yung conception ko of what is visual literacy in mass media, in advertising, diba? Even sabihin natin cultural studies, archivists would have a different set of terminologies. If I'm a teacher in preschool, I would probably have a different set of applications to the term visual literacy. And if you go to the world of art, lalo na contemporary art, then mas wide-reaching din yung terminologies na doon. So given that, probably we need visual literacy. However, there is a crisis. Una, walang working definition as mentioned by Sir Francis. And pangalawa, even the people who are tasked to create images in mass media, are they literate? So currently ba, sino ba yung agents in the community who are pushing for visual literacy? And when they promote visual literacy, how are they framing it?
Locally, if you ask academic institutions, they're now using yung vocabulary of visual literacy. That's something that I've noticed. Yung when we updated the curriculum ng photography in 2016, I think parang hindi pa widely used yung visual literacy. That's why when we were building the curriculum, we had to benchmark abroad. We had to look at how other photography programs are being done abroad and ano yung mga ginagamit nilang methodologies or ano yung mga ginagamit nila in teaching photography. But now, when you talk to, I think even yung mga certificate courses on photography locally, they're also now using and they've acknowledged the need of visual literacy. So I think yun lang, parang nangyayari kasi visual literacy we think is only for the photography program. We only think na it's for a college degree or whether it's a certificate program in photography, sila lang yung dapat nagtuturo ng visual literacy. But again, yun nga, it's a skill. As Jess mentioned, it's a toolbox eh. Therefore, dapat as early as pre-K, it's already integrated in our curriculum na nabibuild mo yung toolbox na yon. So eventually, when you are confronted with a photograph or when you are tasked to create a photograph, you can go back to that toolbox and identify what specific skills ang kailangan mo for that specific task. Kasi we have to understand that visual literacy is a set of competencies. It's a set of skills. Hindi lang siya one specific skill set na pag ginawa mo to, na-demonstrate mo na visually literate ka. Kasi even when we talk about visual literacy, meron siyang iba-ibang stages of visual literacy eh. So we also have to understand when we want somebody or we want a person or a student to be visually literate, ano ba yung dinedemand din natin sa kanila? What competencies or what level of fluency in the visual language ang hinihingi din natin sa kanila? So I think there is a crisis in visual literacy kasi even institutions or even people are not clear on what the end goal or what they want from the target market that they are surveying.
Yun nga yung tanong ko, sir. I mean, is it a crisis of method, or do we really have a method in the first place to begin with? Like, for example, I've been seeing, especially, well, since total pinag-usapan natin yung photography, I have been seeing like so many photography workshops online out there. Online ads saying that, okay, photography workshop, basic photography work. Pero yung basic na pag-aaralan nila is like aperture, shutter speed,
Technicality.
ISO. I mean that's not basic photography. That's basic camera operation. Di ba? Parang I don't know. Parang walang. I mean, yun yung question ko. I mean, do we really have a method on spreading visual literacy?
I think meron ng method eh. If we look at other institutions, there's already a method.
Okay.
I think we have to just define yung ano yung end goal natin. Like with sa academic institution, when you look at visual literacy, we define it simply as reading and writing in the language of photographs. Kasi we cannot just say na it's just reading. Kasi our students our goal is for them to become photographers. Therefore, they're not just going to read photos, but eventually, by learning how to read a photograph, they themselves can write in the language of photography. They can create. So in that aspect, I think for some academic institution, clear sa kanila. Kaya din when I see also yung mga workshops online on visual literacy, may nakita nga ako isang workshop, kinakwento ko nga kay Tony, yung ginawa lang exercise sa visual literacy was they were memorizing or identifying photographs. Parang if you can identify a photograph, the photographer, the year, or what the image title was, you're visually literate. Pero yun nga, parang connect mo siya. Is that really the kind of visual literacy that we want for photographers? Mamaya for a critic or for an art critic or for an ordinary viewer, it's enough. Pero sa photographers, mamaya kulang pa. Kaya I think nagkakaroon ng crisis sa method kasi hindi din man clear what is the end goal for, let's say, what we want with visual literacy. So I think it's important, it's clear, what do we want to get out of visual literacy for us to identify and craft a method to teach it.
Yeah. I agree, sir. I mean, a bit of parang disclaimer. I mean, yung minention ko kanina about the method. Yeah, of course. I mean, ACFJ, Ateneo, CSB has been, and some other, universities who has been teaching, the arts and photography. Yeah, pinag-usapan yung visual literacy. But my question is, I mean, do we really have, as a country, as a society, have a method of, discerning or learning about visual literacy? I mean, is it something that is institutional? I mean, yun nga, yung sinasabi nyo nga kanina, sir. I mean, like for example, I mean sa mga grade school students, it is something that we were not taught. I mean, especially like for example, I mean myself. I mean, I was not taught about visual literacy when I was in elementary or kindergarten or high school. It was only in college when I took fine arts, something that's very specialized. Of course, that's very specialized. That I learned about visual literacy. That there's something like visual literacy only during that time. Parang sa Pilipinas, I mean, yung mga bata, I mean, if you ask them about visual literacy, nakakain ba yan? Game ba yan? Something like that.
So
Yeah, I think it's institutional wide, wala. I think yun yung isa din problem eh. So parang it's individual initiative of different institutions.
Yung in support siguro dun sa sinabi din ni Francis, no? At least for Benilde, syempre we are a school. In the pedagogy and in the creation of a curriculum, that has to be there. The question would be outside the colleges. If you go to the professional organizations like ACFJ, basically they're teaching visual literacy for professionals. ACFJ, let's say, is a professional institution. They teach journalism and photojournalism. They have diploma courses. But outside these institutions, do we have any?
Meron lang akong disclaimer. I mean, before we go to that, since we've already mentioned it about the ACFJ, I mean, I was a dropout twice of ACFJ, but it is a very very highly recommended course, especially if you want to be a photojournalist, here in the Philippines, and I know that they are konting plug lang din. I they are offering the course to students, not only in the Philippines but in Southeast Asia as well. So yun. So if you want to be a photographer or you want to be a photojournalist, I mean, you should really really consider applying to ACFJ, and they have scholarships as well, as I understand. Yun lang. Going back to what you were saying, I mean, about the method. Yun nga yung tanong ko eh. I mean, do we really have a method? Is it something that's is visual literacy something that's being taught at schools?
Siguro at least for now, to have a certain thread dun sa discussion natin, lumalabas there are two areas where visual literacy should be taught. For the purpose of simplicity, visual literacy can be contextualized in basic education and then professional education. So for basic education, medyo missing to because the term itself is not being used in the first place. There's no working definition. So how can you come up with a curriculum or curricula for basic education when in fact you're not even, I mean, the concept itself is not present in the vocabulary. However, at least for education in the institutions like Benilde and also siguro for the Viscom sa UP, for other schools, merong concept of visual literacy. So we siguro will go to the professional usage of the term. Why I'm going to do that, why I'm going to shift the conversation naman to the professional usage of the term and also the professional methods of teaching the concept is that personally, if I were not a teacher, I would expect the professionals to practice it. So at the minimum, kung wala man siya in general education, at least to a certain extent, by demonstration of teachers, of professional imagers and practitioners, through their demonstration, I might learn visual literacy. So now I would shift now the question to the professional field. In the professional field, how is visual literacy being demonstrated? Since the term itself probably is new, but we cannot say naman na totally wala siya because again, we have had generations of photojournalists, we have had generations of artists, we have had generations of teachers. So we cannot say naman totally hindi present yung konsepto na yon. But at present, would you characterize the way it is demonstrated or the lack thereof in professional practice?
Gusto ko lang balikan yung sinabi mo kanina, yung about visual literacy and photography. Actually, malaki yung yung role ng photography. Why? Because almost everyone now has a cell phone camera, especially in the Philippines. And napakalaki ng market ng cell phones with cameras here in the Philippines. And actually, I haven't seen the statistics, but I think we are one of the who has the most cell phone buyers and users in the world, especially yung paggamit natin ng social media, Facebook, etc. etc. Ang laki ng market. So ano yung kinalaman ng photography? I think I personally think photography has a large responsibility or a huge role to play because of the proliferation of cell phone cameras today. So wala, I mean, magiging photography talaga yung magiging center ng everything, especially digital photography is gonna be the center of everything.